Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us. My name is Shuchi, and I'm delighted to co-host this conversation with my colleague, Brittany. We're joined by an incredible group of panelists to talk about the momentum in ESG. And today is all about celebrating our speakers for the amazing work they're doing in this space. We have Nathalie FLORES, an international public policy specialist and the vice chair of the United Nations Climate Change Science and Technology Body at UNFCCC. She represented at the recent climate talks at Bonn. We're going to get into the details, and will be at the next Conference of Parties, which is COP29. And congratulations on your re-election, Nathalie. And that's great. We have Nicole. Nicole is a leader in circularity. She co-founded the Renewal Workshop, which was acquired in March 2022 by global logistics company Bleckmann, and Nicole now leads their circularity strategy. Welcome, Nicole. Derek, we have Derek Sivori. Derek is a senior director at the Sustainability Strategy and Communications Agency Think Parallax, and the host of their Inspiring Perspectives podcast. So we'll make sure to check that out as well. A former vice president of global sustainability at Qualcomm. Welcome, Derek. Thank you all for being here. And thank you, Brittany, for co-hosting this conversation with me. And yeah, really excited to hear about your experience and insights and perspectives during this hour. So Nathalie, maybe I'll start with you. Can you tell us a little bit about your work at the UN and your work in climate in general, and what role do you think UN plays in climate?
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you very much for having me. I'm very, very happy to be here, reporting from the Latin America and the Caribbean Climate Summit in Cartagena right now. So as you said, I serve as vice chair of the Science and Technology Body of the UN Climate Change. To give you like a little scope on how it works, we have the Rio Conventions, which are the UN Climate Change, the UN Certification Convention, and the UN Biodiversity Convention. So these three conventions came from the concept of sustainability of Rio Plus 20 back in 1992. And each of this convention that operates under the UN system has a different body. And these bodies are put into place for countries to be able to discuss between each other at the multilateral level. So, you know, when a country is implementing foreign affairs, they do it either through bilateral engagements or through the multilateral engagement. Of the UN, the concept comes from the multilateral level. I think this is important to understand because sometimes and lately that I have this engagement as vice chair, people ask a lot like, but what's the UN position? What the UN think? And I think something really important to understand is that the United Nations is a club of government, literally. So each of us as taxpayer in any country of the world, we pay taxes, and from our taxes, our representatives, our governmental representatives represent us at the multilateral level to make decisions at the global scale that then downscale into national schemes, no matter what convention is. There are many environmental conventions and related to the topics that are in the scope of environmental, social, and governance. But of course, the UN climate change that I have the honor to serve, it's basically the most famous one. And when people talk about COP, it's funny because all the conventions have a conference of the parties. So the conference of the parties, even when the term it's very popular for people to attend the COP itself, it's a body. So it's the highest level under any of the three UN climate change Rio Convention, and it's where ministers take the final decision on the legal framework on the global legal framework. Then we have under each of this convention a science and technology body, that I have the honor to serve as vice chair in terms of climate change. And then we have the implementation body. So the science and technology body is the one that makes the technical decisions, correct? So upon a process of submission that countries submit to the convention, if and sorry I'm being repetitive, but through a process that is established by the parties, we do submissions, and from the submissions we put together draft decisions that are accompanied by technical service and legal service from the UN climate change. And that happens in the science and technology body because first we need, before making policy, we need to make sure that the science behind the policy is accountable and it's held accountable. So that's why the science and technology body first study the science behind what we want to turn into policy in order to make a balance. And then after a technical decision is passed, so for example, we have one period of submissions, then we have 2 years of workshops and studies and a study in the science, and then we go to the decisions that are political under the science and technology body. And then the implementation body allocates through decisions, global decisions, allocate funds for the implementation of these policies. So I always put the example of gender action plans. So first we have to follow up on the gender gap under the convention at global scale. Then we have to study equity, then we have to study equality, then we have to study inclusion, and then negotiators come to the table to actually put into place a decision that unlocks funds to establish gender action plans within the countries that with focus on climate change vulnerability, just to give you an example. Then you have all the countries creating gender and climate change policies after one decision at the UN climate change is taken, and that unlocks funds for capacity building, climate change mitigation with focus on gender, just to get I'm using just this as an example, correct? Then adaptation, taking into account vulnerability and everything that we need to do, technology transfer, and of course the global stocktake, that it's the ultimate goal of the convention, which is reducing carbon emissions. I think I can leave it there for now, and then we keep the conversation. But basically what we do with this explanation is moderate the process in which the parties talk to each other at the negotiations tables.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for all your work, and thank you for everything. Derek, maybe I'll go next to you. You moved from a brand to an agency and work with a portfolio, I'm assuming now. What have you seen change in the last, over the however many years you've been involved in climate? And tell us a little bit about your work at Think Parallax.
Yeah, thank you. It's changed a lot. I've been in it for I guess a minute, and so going from a brand to an agency has been really fascinating. It's been really interesting. Think Parallax is a full service sustainability strategy and communications agency. So we're in the business of helping companies and brands, whatever stage they're at, to really build out their sustainability programs. And what I love both sides. Working in-house was great because we got to build out a program. I started the journey back in the early 2000s. So at that time, it was really just this sort of a rally cry and something that was exciting and something that a few people knew needed to be done. And so it really felt fun to be sort of part of what felt like a pioneering space. But there wasn't a lot of policy happening. There wasn't a lot of legislation. There weren't a lot of, your peers might have been doing it. There were just a handful of companies and brands that you could point to say, look how awesome that is. So we should do that as well. Working now on the agency side is amazing because it's become so much more complicated. It's moving a lot quicker. It's more advanced. The conversations are a lot more technical. The expectations are higher. The urgency, of course, is there. So having the opportunity to work with different companies of different sizes and different sectors it's a great opportunity to get a little bit behind the scenes, see what their challenges are, see what their hopes are, their aspirations are, and just see how the inner workings are. But ultimately, almost all companies of all different sizes and all sectors are dealing with the same pressures, the same resistance, and the same struggles, maybe that we've still worked almost 15, 17 years ago. So I'll leave it there, and I'm sure we'll
Yes.
continue on that conversation.
Absolutely. Looking forward to diving deep into all the topics. So, Nicole, welcome again. You moved from running your own company to now being a part of a larger organization. Could you tell us about the experience? And also, you've been in the space of education as well. How has circularity changed over the years? And tell us about your work in the space.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, so I like with it, I've known Derek a long time. So back in the early 2000s, I started in sustainability, and then in 2014 started a company called the Renewal Workshop to address circularity from a very practical perspective. So we were doing all this great stuff related to making products more sustainable, but at the end of the day, we were making more products. And I think circularity was starting to get a lot. It had been around a long time, but it was starting to come up because it was sort of timely, right? Like we had addressed these sustainability topics, and now people were thinking like the aha I had was happening as well with other people. So the Renewal Workshop, the company that I started, was built to be a service provider to brands to help them actualize and implement a circular business model. So we would collect products post-consumer, we'd clean and repair them, we'd enable resale, and the goal was to decouple revenue from production so that the brands could actually start to behave more like a circular business model. And we ran the Renewal Workshop for about 7 years. And as you said, we got acquired by Bleckmann, which is a fairly large-sized logistics company based in Europe, UK, and the US. And what's been really exciting is moving from that scrappy startup-y mode of like, how do we figure this out? And everyone always asking, how are we going to scale circularity? To moving inside of a bigger company that's asking the same question. How does Bleckmann show up for the economy in a circular way? What services are we going to need? How are we going to like price this? How are we going to behave differently for the brands when they're ready to be circular? That we're sort of like, we're here, we're ready to catch you, we're ready to help do that. And so that's been really fun to see scale happen in a much bigger way than we were able to do as a startup, because all of a sudden Bleckmann has 40 facilities across various countries. And now we can offer renewal services in all of those. Like the goal is to get them in all of those sites. And so brands don't have to like do so many steps to get to a solution. The solutions are starting to like show up and get closer to them. So that part's really exciting too.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again for your work and being here. Brittany, over to you.
Yeah, fantastic. So I'm so excited to have the three of you here. I think what's really interesting about this panel is that we have representation from both the public sector and the UN, the government side of things, as well as the private sector that have, in both of your perspectives, you've seen this change over time, and you've seen how there's been collaboration and maybe a lack of collaboration across both of those different halves of the equation. So just to bring it back to Nicole for a second, and just to kind of remind folks about maybe where we met each other originally, it was at a conference that we had earlier this year where Nicole spoke on a panel and said something, I think, very profound that I wanted to drill into that I think is very relevant to this conversation. And it was around the need to think about the change that we need at a really systemic level and start to address those problems at that scale, right? It's one thing when, as an organization, as an individual brand, you're committed to making change that you can at that point in time, where that specific place, that node in the chain. How are you approaching, and what success have you seen as you have started to scale at the more systemic level? What are those wins that have maybe helped that transition?
Yeah, it's exactly right way of thinking, and it's also the kind of the hardest way of thinking, right? Because you can, if you think about what can I control, it's the things in my world, and so those are the things I influence. But at the the same time, I am being influenced and controlled by a larger system. And so what is my role inside of that larger system? I think this was a bigger shift for me when moving into circularity. In sustainability, what was really fascinating is we talked a lot about collaboration, and yet we behaved very much still as it was going to be a competitive advantage for us as a brand. And so we behaved that way. We're like, oh yeah, we can talk about the best thing to do in cotton is this, but we're actually gonna be like over here and keeping our supply chains kind of hidden. In circularity, what was really clear is like, oh, like we're not going to solve all of this by ourselves, because we need the other partners to show up and behave differently at the same time. And so, so some of the wins that we've had is to make that acknowledgement and say, okay, hey, brand, we can show up and serve you better if we give you information so that you could design your products in a way that would be more efficient in order to scale circular operations. Oh, that's information I hadn't gotten like before. And we have this saying, it's like, who am I taking it from and who am I handing it to? And how do I make those handoffs really good between parties? So that's, education, that's like communication, that's really being specific about what we do. So for us, we work a lot with the brands to say, here's 10 ways in which if you did these things differently, I can absolutely make my costs cheaper. And they're like, wow, this is like a different way of working. And then on the other side of like, where do we send things, right? So we educating and making the consumer experience of resale really good, but also with recyclers. Oh, well, how are you getting materials? Well, what if you prepare the materials this way and how could we hand them off to you? So there's a little bit more of like, I want my job to be easier. So I'm going to like look beside me and see who am I handing off and who am I taking from and make that process a lot better. And that's how you sort of work systematically.
I really like that. And I think there's going to be a central theme that we keep coming back to that you hit on so beautifully, and that's communication and collaboration across so many different stakeholders within the value chain or within the ecosystem where we're addressing these challenges. Along the same lines, I'm curious, Nathalie, are you seeing a similar transition? Are you seeing more of that collaboration? Do you have any examples that you might be able to cite of where you might be able to identify information gaps that maybe one country is able to fill, or where that collaboration is starting to happen or accelerate in your work with the UN?
Well, I think the way in which we can basically extrapolate that is I always like to talk about the link between the private sector and the actions that the private sector are taking and what we do at the international framework, because at the end when we are in the international framework, we are based on technology transfer. So the UN climate change has an article that established common but differentiated responsibilities in between countries, correct? So though the Paris Agreement is different, in the Paris Agreement, all the countries, we have all the same responsibility. But when you look into developed countries and the developing countries, which is basically how the whole multilateral framework is divided, everything is based on that exchange of experience in learning from the advances of the others. It comes from something as simple as having a scholarship in which I had the opportunity, for example, to do my master's degree in environmental management and climate change in the United Kingdom, but also an exchange of experience in which I was Fulbright scholar for the US, for example, and I learned on how the federal government works, then how the state level works, how the academia work, how the NGO work, and how the private sector work. And this is really interesting because sometimes we see like the UN framework or what these government entities do when they sit together and what the decisions they are making, like how that affect us. But then you go to the ground, and when you are able to see that countries are implementing policies and putting together, sustainability policies in place for the private sector to drive change, then that's where you see that things, you know, are changing. Lately, that I've been working a little more oriented on the ground to unlock climate finance, and by unlocking climate finance, I mean we go to the UN. We, as small countries, we demand to big countries that we need a more environmental, social, and profitable environment, because that's what sustainability is. But then if we don't take decisions at the international level that can then downscale at national level and enable the environment for the private sector to be able to invest in making their operations cleaner, then we are not going anywhere. So the exchange of experience, it's key, especially because it's, and maybe this is, you know, this is not too diplomatic to say, but it's cheaper for countries when, for big countries, when they have to compensate the adverse effect of climate change in developing countries. It's easier to do it through technology transfer. It's easier to do it through building capacity in the countries, and it's easier for countries to have leaders that then can give back to their countries. At the end, we have to understand something. Like when we are in this international framework, somebody have to do it. For example, in the US, it's the State Department. But then the State Department has a compromise until what they can pass in Congress and make the policies that are taken at global scale. Then you go to the US and you go to each state, for example, California, and you see all those policies into place, and you're like, okay, the private sector is driving change. The private sector is demanding at the state level that we need more sustainable operations in order to learn. So I think at the end, it's important to have the policies into place, but also it's important to demand that your priorities as a business holder, like as Sushi mentioned before, like ServiceNow is going to be at COP29, but what is ServiceNow getting from out of COP29? So it's important to navigate that your representatives are representing the interests of their people, as much as this looks as a cliche. But what we have to do is actually to create the environment to finally have a more sustainable world. It's very, you know, it's like a painter when you are such as terms as environmentalist or something like that. But at the end, I think as political leaders, that's what political leaders needs to deliver. So if we want the economic transformation that comes from reducing carbon emissions specifically, because that's the ultimate goal of the UN Climate Change Convention, we need to implement the 5 pillars of the convention in all the stakeholders, which is capacity building, climate change adaptation, climate change mitigation, global stocktake, and technology transfer. So I'll leave it there for now.
No, that's fantastic. Those are really, really great, compelling examples. Derek, I'm curious, as maybe a leadership or an executive whisperer, how are those conversations playing out in your world? What kind of conversations are you having with private sector leaders that might mirror some of what Nathalie just described with country leaders, with governmental leaders? And how has that changed? I remember we had a great conversation around, you know, over your tenure in the sustainability space, those conversations have evolved a little bit. I'm curious what that looks like for you now. How are those conversations with those private sector leaders that you work with different, and maybe what are some of the reasons for that evolution?
I think, you know, as I listened to Nathalie kind of run through all of those, you know, topics and the 5 pillars and just all of the work that goes on internationally, and the back and forth, the push and the pull, maybe the debating, kind of the waiting for policy to go into place or for legislation to happen. I think that continues to be an issue where leaders are sort of on the sidelines, waiting for the courts to make decisions, waiting for the UN to make a call, waiting for their peers to actually act on something. So there's this sense of, despite how much progress has been made over so many years, it almost feels like now we're at this point where it's so technical, it's so important, and it's so urgent. There's there's a new reason to wait. And now it's because, well, let's just see what they finally tell us that we have to do. So I think there's an excitement. I think there's also what you're starting to see is, companies and brands putting more technical experts in place in the organization. So whether it's coming at it from a legal perspective or a financial perspective, an international or policy perspective, it takes more than just that team. When I was doing it, it was just me as somebody with no sustainability experience starting and running a sustainability department. I look back, I'm like, how and why? But at the time, there were not a lot of experts in that space. So we built and evolved. And now I think it is just, you've got your board putting expectations on you, investors are asking questions, your legal department is asking questions. So I think from the professional and leadership space, I think there is a lot of, hey, we hear it, we see it, we feel it, and just trying to sort through it all and understand, well, what is right and best for our business? And at what point do we need to really jump in and make these hard decisions and be bold? So, and I guess that's the age-old, quandary that leadership has found themselves in when it comes to this space.
Can you think of a good example of maybe a leader taking a bold action or taking that leap, responding to that urgency in a way that maybe they wouldn't have necessarily 5 or 10 years ago?
I think, for example, one of our clients is Neiman Marcus Group. And what I really like is their continuous push from leadership, for example, where the CEO is out in front saying, this is a commitment, this has been good for our business, this is good for our customers, appreciate it. All of our stakeholders see the benefit of having a diverse workforce, having a workforce that is engaged and understands our commitments to climate, to diversity and equity and inclusion, and whatever, all of the different things they're working on. So that's been a great example. And they're in a luxury retail space that is not always known for that. So, and they don't position themselves necessarily as a sustainable company or brand, but leadership is really, really supportive of it at the board level, from the leadership level. So that's been an example that's top of mind for me.
That's perfect. And it's really nice to hear the combination of both the quantitative and the data-driven response and being able to identify actual business outcomes, positive change that's resulted from sustainability-related changes. Alongside some of the qualitative or some of the discourse that has happened and changed and grown around whether it's stakeholder capitalism or sustainability or ESG over that time, that really the data and the experience has aligned with the rhetoric, I guess, of the sustainability movement over time. I guess, Nicole, I'm curious from your perspective, because you focus and so much of your work has benefited from the focus and emphasis on collaboration and really managing communication as a tactic and almost as a strategy in order to make this systemic change. Sometimes that means that it can be a little bit harder to use the quantitative, the reasons to do something. You cited great examples of why something is maybe more cost efficient or why it is better from a business standpoint. But in a world where communication is so important, how do some of the softer challenges around circularity or sustainability or even the ESG backlash, what role does that play in making your job a little bit more challenging? And how do you overcome some of those maybe softer pressures or challenges that tend to flourish in more of the communication or softer sort of language that you have to engage with?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's interesting because I think if you were to interview someone who is maybe 10 years younger than me, would have a very different answer. But like when I started in this space, like in 2004, I was very lucky. I worked for Patagonia out of the gate. And so it was like, you were in a group of people who were like, of course we care about the environment. And I then was hired on at prAna, and when I got there, the company had just gotten bought by a private equity firm, and so it was a little bit like, why are we spending money on this? And it was early days, like prAna was not, we had evolved it to where it is today, but early days it was still there. So yeah, I started when it was just not a thing, where we like, okay, how about we get recycling in the office, and everyone's like, okay, fine, here's my recycling. So it's felt like a challenge for years. and building business cases over time, which is a really tricky thing to do when you're arguing like, how do you measure human rights and workplace safety? And you're trying to find like, well, it improves quality and this like it's a real tug at your heartstrings when you're trying to say like environmental protection. That has evolved so much now. I would say it took like almost 12 years for people to have sustainability be in the room in a strategic way. In circularity, that happened in 5 years. And so when I first started pitching brands on, hey, why don't you resell your products in 2014? All the brands were like, oh, no, we do not do that. We make the good quality products. We make the ones that you want, the new stuff. Like we're in the new business. And, 2 years later, all of a sudden we were reselling apparel for brands and they were really starting to be like, oh, yeah, this makes a lot of sense. Like, wait, we have really good quality product. And we have, so it's evolved over time. And I think that what's nice now is that you don't have to spend so many hours on like building the business case or explaining why or building the context. You can kind of get right into the like, okay, what is the problem you're trying to solve here? Is it like a compliance problem? Is it an employee engagement? Is it your customers are not this? Like, so we can kind of get down into it. And it's sort of the same old of like, meet people where they are, find common ground, where do our goals overlap? Let's start with those places and then bring each other along. I had really good experiences. Our director of design at prAna, I would be like, okay, I want to do this, this, and this. And she would look at it and be like, okay, but I need to do this, this, and this. And then we sort of pick the two places where, okay, materials, let's start there and start to evolve it. And I learned so much about like the design process and how companies really need to think about it and where the customer is and all of this. And me coming around going, you have to do this, you have to do this, and being really over here and not flexible really hindered the process of progress. So that was another place where I feel like communication really helped.
A quick follow-up, Brittany, go ahead if you have.
No, please go for it, Sushi.
Just quickly, what do you think worked? Is it like individual accountability? Is it a sense of urgency that people are understanding at the individual level or company level, or for you, Nathalie, at a country level that has perhaps helped shift the mindset and move the needle? And for each of you, and is it education? What do you think? What do you think works? If Nicole, if you want to continue.
Sure, I'll just very quickly. I think in my experience, one of the biggest things is permission. So like, and making sure that it's really clear, like when we were at, again, to use prAna as an example, the CEO and myself put together like, okay, we are going to have a sustainability strategy and here it is. And all of a sudden everyone was like, oh, I'm allowed to go do this. And it kind of freed up the ability to say hard things and move forward and be messy and experiment because there was permission given for people to go do that work.
Great. Nathalie or Derek? I see you unmuted.
Yeah. Okay. Derek or me?
How about Derek? You go first.
Just on the top of my mind, because jumping in Nicole's, talk of prAna and Patagonia made me think, even of my time in a brand and working with brands. The answer is it's going to always vary and it's going to depend on who you're talking to, right? So if you're sustainability is going to go across every role and every department. So if you're talking to a facilities manager, they have their needs that need to be met. If you're talking to engineering, product development, design in Nicole's case, if you're talking to the retail team, who innovation, whatever department or person you're talking to in their area, they are going to have a specific set of needs and expectations that need to get met. So Nicole's spot on when you have to kind of really sit and spend a lot of time listening, because coming in and saying, we need to reduce, we need to do this, we need to do that, we need to tackle biodiversity and emissions and waste and your water and your pollution, it's overwhelming for them because that is not what they're working on every day. So our job should be to just listen and go, so what are your needs? So it's going to always change depending on what room you kind of enter and walk into and whoever you're talking to.
Awesome. Nathalie.
Yeah, well, from the government's perspective, maybe it's a little bit different because usually like there's an agenda that government need to follow to create policy, regulate the policy, implement international cooperation, and then, you know, as I said before, enable the environment for the private sector. I think the way in which businesses are investing in countries, for example, if you have a multinational that it's in different countries, and then they come to a specific country with policies from another country or another region, like the European Union that has stronger policy in terms of sustainability, or the United States, or, you know, that also drives change in this new country in which these operations are going to be taken. But in terms of the concept of sustainability itself, I think we have citizens that are more aware of the needs to protect the environment, of the need to protect natural resources. Like Derek just mentioned, like when you go to a corporate and you talk to them about water resources, about biodiversity, about making operations cleaner and all of this, it's overwhelming. Yet, if you're like from a country like mine that live from tourism, you need to make the touristic sector to understand that without a protected environment and without sustainability measures into place, you won't be able to actually have that beautiful beach, that beautiful mountain, as simple as it sounds. And I think this is something important, because that when I was working for the government, like the slogan of the Ministry of Environment, it was making sustainability a culture. Making sustainability a culture, because culture makes law. So if you educate your citizen on the need for sustainability, for protecting water resources, perhaps, like I'm from an island, we don't have a snowpack, so our water comes directly from the forest. So we don't have option. We need to protect the forest in order to have water. So, you know, all these things about making operations cleaner and making profit from making your operations cleaner, I think it's key. And I've been mentioning these days that once corporates understand that they can make profit out of their investment in sustainability, environmental, social governance, I think that's when we're going to actually achieve that economic transformation that should come from the concept.
That's wonderful. Brittany?
Yeah. Just to sort of follow up on that, you know, I think within an organization, it's maybe a little bit more straightforward in terms of actually showing that impact, right? We enacted a sustainability policy. We've you know, changed the way that we design. We've changed the materials that we incorporate. We've changed our business model to account for more circularity in terms of what consumer preferences are looking for in terms of our operations. And then you can turn around and show impact. Right, you can show that progress over time. You have something to share with all of those stakeholders. I'm curious, Nathalie, from more of the government perspective, when it's a government that's representing their people, right, and sort of battling it out in terms of what is it that their people need from sort of the rest of the world, from their perspective. How do you then create sort of that evidence or that business case, if you will, that the work that maybe a more developed country has done, or the investment that they've made, how do you then turn around and show that as a success story to other organizations or other governments or other companies that, yes, this is worthwhile work, without necessarily having a balance sheet behind you? Or do you? Like, what does that evidence and proof process look like?
Yeah, as you just explained, it's basically a transformation change, because when we talk about businesses, the business can go straight forward and make the changes they need to do. But when it comes to the whole system of the government, you have to start for the budget that you need to implement something as simple as education. And well, not simple, but you know what I mean, like driving change through education. Because, for example, even if you are going to implement circularity or waste management, or a specific town in a country that needs to follow these rules for when the garbage is taken from your house, like something so simple as separating garbage needs to be part of the whole policy scheme. I think if we see of the compromises that countries have to different treaties, like the UN climate change, I will use that as example of this checklist of what you need to present to showcase what actions are you taking. So for example, in terms of the UN climate change, countries have their main compromise is to make accountability of their carbon emissions, both reductions and emissions in general. So countries compromise to present every 5 years an inventory. So that's a measure, because with that first measure, you have to map the whole country, and you have to measure if the private sector, if certain business, certain emission factors are over there. So you do this whole project, and every country has to do that. So that's a measure that countries do. So if a country reports to the UN that they are actually under, all this accountability that is reviewed, that has third-party reviewers and everything, that you are reducing or you are emitting more, then you're not meeting the ultimate goal of the convention, which is reducing carbon emissions. Then with the Paris Agreement, countries make the compromise of the national determined contributions. So that's another checklist, because that national determined contributions are the voluntary framework in which countries are saying, I'm going to be net zero to this year, and I'm going to be net zero or carbon neutral or carbon negative with these policies. And under that policy, then you establish what are going to be your mitigation actions, what are going to be your adaptation actions, your transversal axes like gender, youth, legal framework, etc. And that also has a tool that is called NDC tracking. So under the NDC tracking, countries need to report to other countries and to the convention how much money they need to actually achieve that national determined contribution, and who it's going to make that accountable. For example, in Dominican Republic, when we presented the NDC in 2020, we allocated to the private sector 5% of the investment that the country needed to achieve their national determined contribution. Probably it's more, or will be more, probably could be less, but there's a part of the national determined contribution in which the government is relaying to the actions of the private sector in that sense. So that's also, accountable, and you account that when you do your NDC tracking, and you're like, okay, the private sector in the tourism sector is investing in adaptation because we have a big goal on adaptation. Like, we don't have an option. We are vulnerable. We need to adapt because it is what it is. We are in the root of hurricanes. As I say before, we live in tourism, but we need to make that accountable. So each action, it's, accountable over there. Then parties have under the convention the National Adaptation Plan. National Adaptation Plan, usually countries establish that by national decree. Those countries that don't have a climate change law or a climate quota to reduce carbon emissions do the National Adaptation Plan. So, all these tools help the countries at global scale to put themselves in perspective and to put themselves saying, okay, both developing and developed countries have the compromise to do this. The difference is that when you are building your inventory or your NDC or your tracking, there's a technology that is being transferred from developed countries that probably small countries don't have the capacity, but the idea is to establish that in the country and having that over there. And to close with that idea of all these compromises to this specific convention, because as I say before, there's other conventions in which countries report other things. For example, the Biodiversity Convention, they have to report other measures of their protection they are doing on natural resources that are very specific, but I don't want to get too deep into that because that's a whole new conversation. But the point is that, for example, when we were building the national determined contribution, and most countries do that, we sat the private sector on the table. So we were like, okay, private sector, tell me, what do you need from me at policy level for you to actually be able to implement a scope in which you can reduce the emissions that come from your sector. So we were working, for example, from the forestry sector, wood, we were working with the agriculture sector, private sector, you know, so private sector in agriculture, private sector in technology. So we sit with them and we ask them, how far can we go in the next 5 years? And now that the country is going to start to do the NDC number 3, then the ideal will be to sit all stakeholders on the table and then put together this decarbonization strategy, because you won't be able to do that without the operation of who drives the economy, that it's in this case the private sector. So that's the way, in general terms, you could put in perspective what each country is doing and how to measure that from the global scale to the national level.
That's so inspiring, and thank you for breaking that down. I just can't help but think, you know, how far maybe we have come as a world, as a global population, to arrive at this point where we're having these conversations, these accountability frameworks are being implemented or being followed, and that we're really talking seriously, and not just talking, but also acting on the agreements that take place at this multinational level. I always like to reflect on that, because I know how quickly it changes, and I know how easy it is to kind of be swept up in the moment and be concerned with the challenges of the moment and like what's next and what we need to fix and the urgency of tomorrow. But I also think it's important to think about where we've come and how we got to where we are today. And I would love to take a moment to just hear from each of you a little bit more about your personal stories, and when you started along your journey in your professional career, or even in your personal careers, how you were sort of motivated to do the work that you did, maybe some of the lessons that you learned along the way, some of the connections that you formed with the folks around you as you were learning and developing these skill sets, because I think those personal stories are what make up the collective change that we've benefited from and will continue to see going forward. So I guess, first of all, you know, Derek, you mentioned right off at the beginning that you've been in the sustainability world for, 20 years or so, starting a sustainability team and organization, really not knowing the skills or having the technical knowledge in order to do that, maybe as you would expect from a sustainability team today. Can you talk a little bit about sort of what got you to that position, what gave you the courage to maybe take on that work, and how you were able to develop that skill set all of these years later, kind of, what that journey was like, and the lessons that helped you to get there?
Yeah, I'm gonna really try to wrap it up tightly here. I know, because there was a lot that happened, and all I could think of is, while Nathalie was kind of explaining the complexities of all of that and what it takes to move things along and working internationally, I kept Nicole's comment about trying to win over a recycling program in your break room. Like, those were the days, right? It's like, Nicole, right? How that was our biggest challenge right then, was just trying to convince people that, hey, this is important. You should use a reusable water bottle. Let's get a water refill station in the break room, right? That was our starting point, and doing volunteer programs and carpooling, etc. And moving from beach cleanups, to which we, was a CSR program at the time. For me, what really changed and motivated me was, one, it was a documentary, right? Watching An Inconvenient Truth back in 2006. We did a lunch and learn, and I just had this aha moment of like, why do I not know this? Why do I not know anything about this? I had an MBA, I had a master's degree. I'd been in the industry for 10 years, so on and so forth. So I dove in, I got excited. And then honestly, meeting people like Nicole and seeing the work they were doing, right? And Vulcan was acquired by Caring, the Caring Group. They immediately assigned, when they were building out their sustainability program, ecosystem services and biodiversity experts, PhDs that were assigned to the brand so that we could do natural capital accounting and environmental profit and loss exercises. To me, that was mind-blowing. I'm like, oh, this is what sustainability is, right? Tackling our supply chains. Every person I met that knew more than me, I just sat and I listened and I watched in awe as they built things and realized there was a community of people doing this other work. So I went from feeling alone in that break room to looking around going, why is nobody seeing this? To knowing that there were other people that were just as excited and that we were building something together. So I think the lessons I learned were just to always listen, always know that there are people that know more, that are doing more. Try to find the incentive for people to join you, and just be excited and passionate about it. There's so much happening in this space. So I'll leave it there and see who else wants to go.
Yeah, I really appreciate your humility, by the way, because you've gone from being sort of alone in the room and listening and learning from everyone else to actually being very vocal and inspirational and changing a lot of hearts and minds around you and kind of paying it forward in that way. And maybe we can come back to that. But I love to see that transition, and I appreciate sort of that advice.
Thanks,
Nicole,
Brittany.
maybe your equivalent?
Yeah, it is funny how when you talk to people in this space, there are moments that really like turn the light bulbs on. I had a whole other career in my early 20s. I was a TV editor at the Discovery Channel in Canada, but I was working on this really cool show about science, and there was an episode, there were two. One was a woman who acknowledged that like coffins are completely toxic, like the laminates that are on it, embalming fluid, the foams that are in there, everything about that experience. And she said something to the effect of, how is it that the last act we do is pollute the environment by being buried in a traditional coffin? And so she started this like bio-based coffin. It was like mushroom fibers, and people could draw on the materials. And it just was like this new way of thinking. And then simultaneously, I was editing a piece about Ford Motor Company, who had to, they were on a Superfund, one of their plants in Detroit, and they had to move the facility, and they brought biologists in to plant plants to basically like clean up the area, and they put a green roof on their building. And this like, it really struck me of like this opportunity of businesses can make change. And then I saw the documentary movie, The Corporation, and got introduced to Interface and Ray Anderson, and just got so inspired by these stories. And so I think it's really important to tell the stories, because you don't know who you're going to inspire. And, like An Inconvenient Truth was Al Gore in a PowerPoint, and it was a movie that really shifted. And so now we have much better storytellers and tools to be able to do this type of work. And the other thing is to be really open. I remember going into early part of my career, just asking people, what should I know? Like, what are the things I should know? And this fantastic woman at Nike said, go figure out how business works. Because if you're going to change business, you need to understand how it works. And so that means you have to understand finance, you have to understand production and supply chains and operations. And so that was a lot of like Derek was mentioning, sitting in the room with the people and going, why do you do what you do? And what does success look like to you? And really understanding the business. And then I could see the places where you could intervene. But like, the other thing I would say is like, we're so trained of like, me, like there's a very me culture, the US probably more so than some other countries. And if you can get your ego out of the room and say like, oh, I can really learn and grow, and we collectively can benefit if I'm not the winner, and I just make sure that like the idea wins. And I think that was something that took me a lot longer than it should have to learn, but that was a definitely big learning for me.
I really love that. And I love your point around sharing your story, because you never know who's going to listen, who's going to hear that, who that's going to inspire. That's so true. I think those stories and those moments hit us at such unexpected times, but it really took somebody putting that in front of you. It took that effort to reach out and make that piece of information available for that to even strike you to begin with. So that's fantastic. Nathalie, I'm curious, as an avid learner yourself, what your story was like. I know you took advantage of incredible opportunities and you're all about paying that forward. Can you tell us sort of how you wound up in Cartagena and kind of what your journey was like to get there?
Yeah, well, I always like to talk about my mentors and people that have played like a big role in my career. But I think the first thing is that being from a very, very, very small town in Dominican Republic in the Caribbean, the only thing I had was the love of my parents and my dreams. So I was always, dreaming of traveling the world, representing my country and everything. And that was like the first seed, probably there was not money to buy clothes, but if we say that we wanted to study, my parents will do everything to give me and my sisters an education. I have three people that I recognize as key, as playing a key role in my career as mentors. First, it was a professor in high school. Once I told him, no, I want to be a diplomat, but also I would like to be congresswoman. And I was like 16 years old or something like that. But I told him that I don't want to go to law school. And he was like, well, you need to go to law school. And I didn't pay attention to that. I enrolled in another program completely different. And in my first day of university, I went and changed to law school. So at the end, I had to pay attention to his recommendation and everything that he was telling me. And yeah, that was very important for me because I understood that the only way for me to represent my country at international level or any country, which I did because I also worked with other countries for 4 years when I was in New York, but was to understand how the legal framework worked, because at the end you are taking international decisions that are going to affect, the national scheme. So that professor played a key role. Also, my two bosses in New York, Kevin Conrad and Federica Vieta from the Coalition for Rainforest Nations, they play a key role because they show me the United States. They showed me New York, which is like a home for me, and seeing their leadership on how academia, private sector, and the international community with the UN in New York, like how this ecosystem work together, and probably most of the respectful people that I know right now came to my life through that opportunity to serve other countries, not only mine. And also my first boss at the Ministry of Environment of the Dominican Republic, because this person planted the seed in me of public service. So public service is like, it becomes part of your DNA. At the end, you really want a good, or at least that's what I learned from all these people, along my career. It's like you're really working for the public good of everyone. And then when you can take it to the international level, and specifically at the UN climate change, now serving as vice chair, but before, when we were working and representing the country with other countries, because it's a consensus convention, so we had to work with block of countries, so 55 countries of the Coalition for Rainforest Nation, 39 countries of the Small Island Developing States, 9 countries of the Central American Integration System. So you build upon the good of all these, groups. So I think first was the driving to actually represent my country other than myself. So because I always wanted to defend my country, and I always say that my best business card is my flag. So for me, it's really important, that driving. And of course, I think giving back. So by giving back is like, I always put myself in perspective, and I tell to myself, okay, you had this opportunity, but I want people around me to have 3 times the opportunity I have had, because sometimes we even lose scholarships, fellowships, opportunities to do internship with businesses or meeting businesses at, I don't know, different levels that actually can change the game. And when you operate with the drive and change perspective, then you will drive change, because then people will like to actually do the same, or at least that's what I feel, you know, from my experience, of course. And last is the companies that I'm now advising on how to talk better with governments, and you know, outside of my 6 weeks at the UN every year, I'm doing consultancy now, and I think that the companies that gave me the opportunity to actually listen what I have to say and learn from my experience with all these governments, all these businesses around that, but also me learning from them in terms of what the private sector needs. I think that's what has drive change, and that, you know, fuels myself, and also mental health, you know, having a balance on all of that.
Oh, wow. I'm sitting here in awe with all of your contributions to this world. Thank you for all you do. Sadly, we're at the top of the hour and we can continue this conversation for hours, but just wanted to express our deepest gratitude for you being here, for sharing your insights. And I know there is one question, Nathalie, maybe we'll answer it offline for you specifically. But yeah, thank you again. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your insights. Thank you for your presence. Thank you for being here. So really appreciate it. All right.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Take
Thank
care.
you so much.